brush fire is growing in the Everglades.
With thousands of acres already scorched, firefighters are battling to get things there under control.
19,200 acres had been burned since the fire started on Monday.
The fire crews call it reading the ash. After a controlled burn moves through a stretch of sawgrass, the ground left behind tells a story that the living landscape had been hiding for decades. In late 2025, in a remote corner of South Florida's wetlands, that story turned out to be far darker than anyone on the burn crew expected. They had planned for snakes. What they found instead was an absence, a silence spread across acres of blackened earth where there should have been life scrambling in every direction. This is the story of how fire, one of the oldest tools humans have ever used to manage land, became the only instrument capable of exposing an invasion that had been growing, quietly and almost invisibly, for more than 30 years. Long before anyone in South Florida had heard the words invasive species, the Everglades already had a relationship with fire. Lightning storms would sweep across the sawgrass prairies during the wet season, igniting the dry undergrowth and clearing away dead plant matter. This wasn't a catastrophe for the ecosystem. It was maintenance. Fire kept woody shrubs from taking over the open marsh, returned nutrients to the soil, and refreshed the mosaic of habitats that supported everything from wading birds to deer to the elusive Florida panther. Land managers have continued that tradition through prescribed burns, carefully timed fires set deliberately during the dry season to mimic what nature used to do on its own. For most of the 20th century, these burns served a fairly simple ecological purpose: keep the marsh healthy, keep the trees at bay, keep the cycle going. But somewhere along the way, these fires picked up a second job. They became a surveillance tool in a war that wildlife officials never expected to fight, a war against a predator that should never have set foot or scale on Floridian soil in the first place. The Burmese python is native to the swamps, grasslands, and forests of Southeast Asia, where it evolved over millions of years alongside predators and prey that understood how to coexist with it. In the wetlands of Florida, none of that history applied. Nothing here had ever seen a constrictor capable of growing past 15 feet and weighing more than a grown man. Their arrival traces back to the exotic pet boom of the 1980s and 1990s, when South Florida became something of an epicenter for importing unusual animals. A baby Burmese python was a novelty, small, patterned, and easy to manage in a terrarium. Few buyers understood, or perhaps chose not to think about, how large the animal would eventually become. What starts as a 2-foot hatchling can reach 8 or 9 feet within a couple of years, and owners who once found the snake charming increasingly found themselves overwhelmed by an animal that ate constantly, grew relentlessly, and required space most suburban homes simply didn't have. Rather than surrender the snakes to shelters or euthanize them, a portion of owners chose the path of least resistance, release. Driving to the edge of the wetlands and letting the snake go must have felt, to some, like an act of mercy. In practice, it was closer to opening a door onto a fully stocked buffet with no natural predators waiting on the other side. Then came Hurricane Andrew in 1992, a storm so powerful that it tore apart breeding facilities and private collections across South Florida. Cages that had contained these snakes for years suddenly didn't exist anymore, and an unknown number of pythons, likely numbering in the hundreds, were scattered into the wild in a matter of hours. The Everglades, warm, humid, dense with cover, and overflowing with prey that had never learned to be afraid of a python, offered the perfect place to disappear. What makes the Burmese python such an effective invader isn't raw aggression. It's patience. These are ambush predators, built to lie motionless for hours or days, blending into mud root systems and shadow with a precision that fools even trained biologists walking a few feet away. They can hold their breath for half an hour underwater. They can go weeks between meals. And unlike a pack predator that needs a group to hunt effectively, a single python can quietly work through a habitat all on its own. It was against this backdrop that land managers began to notice something unusual happening during their routine prescribed burns. In places where the python problem ran deepest, the burns weren't just clearing brush, they were exposing snakes in numbers nobody had anticipated. A controlled burn works by removing standing vegetation and the thick mat of dead plant material, called thatch, that accumulates at ground level. For a Burmese python, that thatch layer functions almost like a bedroom. It's where they regulate their body temperature during cooler nights, where they wait in ambush for passing prey, and where they hide from anything moving above them. Strip that layer away, and a python loses its cover entirely. Because pythons are ectotherms, meaning they depend entirely on their surroundings to control body temperature, A freshly burned field becomes physically unbearable for them almost immediately. Blackened earth under direct Florida sunlight heats up fast, and a python caught in that heat has no choice but to move. Movement, for an animal that survives by staying still and unseen, is exactly what makes it vulnerable. During a burn conducted in Palm Beach County in the spring of 2025, land managers watched this play out across hundreds of acres. As flames stripped away the grass cover, the ground itself seemed to shift and ripple, not because of one or two snakes slipping away, but because of dozens moving at once, hiding in plain sight until the fire forced them into the open. The scale of what those flames revealed went beyond anything the standard survey methods had suggested. What troubled the biologists walking through these burn scars wasn't only the sheer number of pythons they encountered. It was everything they didn't encounter alongside them. A healthy prescribed burn in a functioning Everglades ecosystem typically sends smaller animals scattering in every direction, rabbits darting for new cover, birds lifting off in startled clusters, insects launching into frantic, chaotic flight. In the areas where the python population runs deepest, biologists have reported the opposite. The fire flushes out python after python, but almost nothing else moves. No birds. No mammals bolting for safety. Just ash, heat, and snakes. One field contractor working in December 2025 near the Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Management Area described the unsettling stillness of walking through a fresh burn scar. He had spent years removing pythons from this exact stretch of wetland and thought he understood the scale of the infestation. Crouching in the ash after that particular burn, he later said the scene simply felt wrong, not because of what was there, but because of what so clearly wasn't. The fire hadn't just revealed pythons. It had revealed a hollowed-out ecosystem, a food web quietly gutted from the inside over years while almost no one was watching closely enough to notice. Researchers have started to frame it plainly. The fire isn't only exposing the predator. It's exposing the void that predator has been carving into the landscape for 3 decades. Setting a burn that accomplishes all of this without causing serious damage is far more complicated than simply lighting dry grass on fire. Fire managers spend weeks, sometimes months, preparing for a single operation, gathering data on soil moisture at multiple depths, tracking weather patterns, and mapping the history of previous burns in the same area. They're searching for what's often referred to as the Goldilocks window, conditions dry enough to carry a productive fire, but not so dry that the flames burn too hot and scorch the underlying peat soil, which took centuries to form and would not recover within a human lifetime if destroyed. At the same time, conditions need to be controlled enough that the fire won't jump containment lines and threaten nearby roads or communities. These operations are typically timed for Florida's dry season, running from December through May, when water levels in the marsh drop and the sawgrass becomes dry enough to burn cleanly. Crews target areas already known as python hotspots, regions like the Big Cypress National Preserve and sections of Everglades National Park where infestations have historically run deepest. In these zones, the strategy isn't subtle. Clear the cover, expose the ground, and force the snakes into terrain where they have nowhere left to hide. Ground crews on airboats and swamp buggies handle much of the ignition work, but larger operations increasingly rely on helicopters equipped with aerial ignition systems, dropping small incendiary spheres that ignite on contact with the ground. This allows teams to burn thousands of acres in a single afternoon, at a scale no ground-based crew could achieve on foot. Once a burn cools enough to walk, the real hunt begins. Python removal contractors, professionals paid per snake captured, working long overnight shifts through mosquito swarms and standing water, describe the days immediately following a burn as a completely different kind of hunting experience. In unburned marsh, python coloring is remarkably effective camouflage. The tan and brown pattern mimics dappled light and shadow so convincingly that even experienced trackers can walk within a foot of a python without noticing it. On the flat, blackened ground of a fresh burned scar, that same coloring becomes a liability. A snake that would be invisible in tall grass stands out sharply against scorched earth. Tracking studies using implanted radio transmitters have measured just how dramatically python behavior changes after a fire. Snakes tracked through burn events increased their overall movement by close to 50% in the days that followed, apparently searching for new cover and struggling to relocate food sources. That surge in movement translates directly into more sightings. Following one of the Palm Beach County burns in 2025, field reports of python sightings rose by roughly 15% within just 2 days, a significant jump for a species that is famously difficult to detect under normal conditions. One contractor recalled tracking a large female python found near a limestone outcrop just days after a burn, discovered because there was almost no natural cover left for the animal to use. The snake, measuring over 11 feet and carrying a clutch of eggs, struck out when approached but had lost the mechanical advantage that dense grass and root systems normally provide for leverage. Without that cover to brace against, the animal that would have been nearly impossible to catch in an unburned marsh was subdued relatively quickly. Removing a gravid female before she can lay 100 eggs effectively eliminates an entire future generation in a single capture. Technology has only sharpened this post-burn advantage. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras can now scan burned areas from hundreds of feet up, spotting pythons basking on open, blackened ground in a way that would be completely impossible through dense sawgrass canopy. Thermal imaging, which struggles to penetrate thick vegetation, works far more effectively against cleared terrain. Environmental DNA sampling, testing water for trace genetic material, can be cross-referenced with drone survey data to narrow down search areas with a level of precision that wasn't available even a few years ago. But the window doesn't stay open long. Florida's climate pushes new growth through the ash within days, and once green shoots return, the cover comes back with them. Hunters typically have only a few weeks after each burn before the advantage closes, and increasingly, they suspect the snakes themselves are learning to anticipate this cycle, lingering near the edge of burn zones where they can retreat into unburned cover at the first sign of a threat. Here's where the story takes an uncomfortable turn, one that researchers are still hesitant to state with full confidence, but increasingly cannot avoid discussing. There's a growing concern among field ecologists that repeated burn and hunt cycles might be doing more than just removing pythons from the population. They might be inadvertently training the survivors to become far harder to catch. Ecologists studying tagged python movement data after repeated burn cycles in the Big Cypress region have noticed a pattern that goes beyond simple caution. Snakes that survived multiple burns weren't just better at avoiding detection. Their behavior appeared to be shifting in fundamental ways. They moved almost exclusively during the darkest hours of the night, avoided roads and levees that once served as convenient travel corridors, and retreated into limestone solution holes under conditions that wouldn't normally have driven them underground at all. The theory researchers are grappling with is essentially an accidental selection experiment playing out in real time. Ordinarily, evolutionary adaptation unfolds across thousands of generations, but sustained, intense hunting pressure applied to a geographically confined population can accelerate behavioral shifts far more quickly than that. Every season, the pythons most likely to be caught are the ones that behave carelessly, basking in the open, moving during daylight after a burn, reacting slowly to unfamiliar stimuli like the scent of fuel used in prescribed fires. Removing those individuals season after season leaves behind a population skewed toward the most cautious, least detectable animals. Contractors report finding snakes in locations that would have seemed almost implausible 5 years ago, buried deep in bedrock crevices during cold snaps that should have been lethal, surviving conditions that killed other tracked individuals nearby. There's also concern that repeated burning, by changing the visual character of the landscape itself, might eventually favor darker-colored or melanistic pythons, which already exist in small numbers within the wild population. Against permanently blackened terrain, a darker snake would have a natural camouflage advantage that a traditionally patterned python does not. Researchers are careful not to overstate this concern before the data fully supports it, but the underlying logic is sound enough to worry serious scientists. The very tool being used to expose these animals could, over enough burn cycles, be shaping the next generation into something considerably better at avoiding detection than its predecessors. The python problem hasn't stayed neatly contained within the wetlands where it began. Snakes have been documented swimming between islands in the Florida Keys, crossing open saltwater in ways that shouldn't be survivable for what is fundamentally a freshwater species. They've turned up in residential neighborhoods in Miami-Dade County, coiled near pool equipment or hiding in backyard vegetation, likely drawn by warmth and the abundance of small pets and wildlife found in suburban settings. South Florida's extensive canal network appears to function as more than just infrastructure. It may be serving as a transit system that allows pythons to move efficiently from deep wetland habitat directly toward populated areas. There's also concern that intensifying hunting pressure in core territories could push the population outward rather than shrinking it, displacing snakes toward the fringes of their range rather than reducing overall numbers. Meanwhile, deep interior sections of the Everglades, areas too wet to burn safely and too dense to survey effectively, may be sheltering an undisturbed population entirely beyond the reach of current detection methods, potentially including older, larger females capable of laying massive egg clutches without ever encountering a human threat. Fire remains the most effective large-scale tool available, but it's far from the only approach being explored. Scientists are researching gene-drive technology, a method of introducing heritable genetic modifications designed to skew python reproduction heavily toward male offspring, which would gradually collapse the population's ability to reproduce. The concept is promising in theory, but it carries real risks. Genetic modifications don't always stay confined to their intended target species, and the possibility of unintended gene transfer to native reptile species, creating unforeseen consequences for animals conservationists are actively trying to protect, remains a serious concern. Pheromone-based traps are also under development, using synthesized chemical signals that mimic a receptive female python to draw males out of dense cover. Some researchers worry that if this approach were deployed at a large enough scale, it could function less like a targeted trap and more like a beacon, potentially drawing pythons in from surrounding areas and concentrating the population rather than reducing it. For now, prescribed fire remains the tool that produces measurable, immediate results. It resets the landscape, strips away 3 decades of accumulated cover, and gives native species, however few remain, a brief window without constant predation pressure. The smoke rising over the Everglades during burn season looks, to most outside observers, like simple destruction. But for the biologists and contractors working these fires, it represents something closer to a diagnostic tool, a way of making visible a threat that has spent 30 years growing in the shadows of dense, undisturbed marsh. What the fires have made undeniably clear is that the python problem in South Florida is larger, deeper, and more entrenched than earlier surveys suggested. The silence found in these burn scars, the near-total absence of native mammals and birds that should have been fleeing alongside the snakes, may ultimately prove to be the most important discovery to come out of this entire strategy. It's a stark measurement of exactly how much has already been lost. The grass will grow back, as it always does after a burn. The real question researchers are left sitting with isn't whether the vegetation will return. It's whether the animals hiding within it are quietly becoming better equipped to survive the very method being used to find them, and what that could mean for the next chapter of this decades-long struggle to reclaim one of America's most unique ecosystems.